Hi, welcome back. This is Chapter 8. This is lecture number 5 of 6. In this particular section, we're going to cover the immune system and also the respiratory system. So we'll also be starting on slide number 246 out of a total of 343 slides. We're almost there, guys. Almost there. Alright, so thymus, it's located in the thorax, anterior to the aorta, and also posterior to the upper sternum. Is divided into lobes or lobules that are inward extending. They contain large amounts of lymphocytes, including primarily inactive thymocytes is what they're referred to. Some thymocytes mature into T cells, and T cells are what obviously provides us our immunity. The spleen is located in the upper left abdominal cavity, inferior to the diaphragm, and also posterior and lateral to the stomach. The spleen is the largest lymphatic organ in our lymphatic system. Unlike the lymph nodes, its venous sinuses are filled with blood and not lymph. Via the action of the macrophages and also the lymphocytes, the spleen filters blood similarly to the way that the lymph nodes filter lymph. Okay, so the immune system, there are two anatomic components. We have lymphoid tissues and immune cells. The two primary lymphoid tissues are bone marrow and the thymus gland. The red bone marrow, which is found in the bones of children and in some adult bones, is essential for the formation of mature blood cells, and it also produces B lymphocytes. Your T lymphocytes originate from the precursor cells of the bone marrow and leave the bone marrow and mature in the thymus gland. The lymphoid tissues contain immune cells that are positive to intercept pathogens before they reach the general circulation system. And then there's clusters of lymphoid tissues that are associated with the skin and the respiratory, along with urinary, GI, and reproductive tracts. These are mucosa-associated types of limbic cells or lymphoidal tissues. One of those things that we kind of take for granted that's a part of that is the tonsils. Gut-associated lymphoid tissues are under the inner lining of the esophagus and also the intestines. Salivary and lacrimal glands. Salivary and lacrimal glands produce an antibody secretion of hemoglobin A, which bathes mucous membranes and protects them. Saliva fights the pathogens that enter the mouth. It also fights pathogens specifically that enter eyes through the formation of tears. Although these play an important role in immunity, the primary cells of the immune system are the white blood cells. The respiratory system. So now we've moved out of the immune system. Respiratory system is a pretty short section on the actual immune system itself, but the respiratory system is going to be pretty significantly longer. All right, so obviously the primary function of our respiratory system is to bring oxygen into the body and eliminate carbon dioxide, which is our waste of respiration. It also provides non-specific defenses against disease and helps to control our pH in our body for homeostasis purposes and permits vocalization. All right, so the respiratory component is composed of the respiratory tract, the respiratory membrane, the lungs, the diaphragm, the muscles of the chest wall, and the accessory muscles of breathing, which permit normal respiratory movement, along with the nerves from the brain and the spinal cord from those muscles. The airway is separated into upper and lower structures based upon their location above or below the glottis or the glottic opening. The upper airway includes the respiratory structures within the head and the neck, and the lower airway includes the respiratory structures in the chest. So, just as a quick review of your anatomy and physiology, we're talking about upper airway, which includes the nose, the mouth, the tongue, the jaw, the oral cavity, the larynx, the pharynx. Major functions of this portion of our airway is to warm, filter, and humidify air as it moves along its pathways to the trachea. The entrance to the respiratory tract at the nasal and oral cavities, and then the pharynx between the nasal cavity and the larynx and the posterior to the oral cavity. It's composed of the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The upper airway, when we talk specifically about the nasopharynx, it extends from the back of the nasal cavity to the soft palate. The posterior portion is the soft palate, which is made up of mucous membranes, muscular fibers, and also mucosal glands that have no bony support. The palatoglossal arch is the posterior border of the oral cavity and the extension of the soft palate. The uvula, that little piece of meat that hangs down in the back of your throat, looks funny every time you look at it. It's downward from the posterior part of the soft palate and extends to the palatoglossal arch. When swallowing, muscles elevate the soft palate so that it touches the posterior wall of the pharynx, sealing off the nasopharynx from the oropharynx. Nasal cavity is lined with a ciliated mucous membrane, and then the nasopharynx is divided into two passages by the nasal septum. Composed of ethmoid and vomer bones and cartilage, the nasal cavity contains turbinates. Turbinates are three curved bone shelves inside each nasal passage that cause turbulence in airflow, marking inhaled particles to stick to the walls of the nostrils. The combination of vascular supply and turbulence warms, filters, and humidifies the air as we breathe. Along the lateral walls of the nasal passages that extend to the frontal and maxillary sinuses are specific eustachial tube endings, which are beginnings, which are passages from the inner ear that allows drainage of fluid as well as equalization of pressure that may occur behind the tympanic membrane. Then we have olfactory receptors. They're located in the epithelium tissues and are responsible for recognizing odors as we smell them. The back of the nasal cavity opens up into the oropharynx. Here's a figure shows the divisions of the upper airway to include the oral cavity, the larynx, and also the pharynx. This is on slide number 254. We talk specifically about some functions of the oropharynx, which begins at the level of the soft palate and extends to the epiglottis. Basically, it functions as a passageway for both air and food. Right? It begins superiorly at the level of the soft palate and extends to the epiglottis inferiorly. Then the posterior pharynx has a rich supply of sensitive nerves. Stimulation of this area triggers our gag reflexes. The palatopharyngeal arch is the entrance to the throat or to the pharynx. Associated structures in the back of the throat include the tonsils and our adenoids. Within the mouth are several structures that have relevance to the airway, namely the teeth, the tongue. The hyoid bone serves as the primary anchor of the tongue and allows support of the trachea and the larynx by the means of several different ligaments. The upper airway continued. We go into the laryngopharynx, which extends from the epiglottis to the top of the esophagus. The laryngopharynx functions in respiration and digestion and extends from the epiglottis to the top of the esophagus. It opens into the larynx anteriorly and the esophagus posteriorly. The larynx joins the pharynx to the trachea. Three purposes: to facilitate the passage of air, as a sphincter to prevent foreign solids and liquids from entering the lungs, and to produce speech. In the superior border of the epiglottis, or the glottis is the epiglottis, the arytenoid cartilages form the posterior attachment of the vocal cords, and they're valuable guides for endotracheal tubes. The vestibular folds are the false vocal cords, and the true vocal cords are found within the larynx itself. The piriform fossae are two pockets of tissue on the lateral borders of the larynx. All right, continue on now into the lower airway. Structures include the trachea, the bronchial tree, the alveoli, and the lungs. Those structures, specifically with the trachea, connects the larynx to the lungs. It lies interior to the esophagus and bifurcates into two primary bronchi, also called the mainstream bronchi. And just for your reference, the bifurcation happens at the structure called the carina, which that carina is a very important structure to remember when we talk about pediatrics, because at the carina, it is the narrowest part of the airway for pediatrics, and it actually allows for uncuffed tubes in young pediatrics to be held in place there at the area of the carina. Also, lining with the columnar epithelial tissue and globular cells that produce mucus that blankets the lining of the conducting airways. So you have a lot of different cellular structures in there that provide lubrication for everything that goes within that airway. Then there's an entire gel layer moved out of the tracheobronchial tree, which is swallowed or expectorated, one way or the other. So as the extra mucus builds up, either you're going to swallow it or you're going to cough it out. The ones that are created by the columnar epithelial tissues. Alright, so continue on with the bronchial tree. Those are airways leading from the trachea to the alveoli. The branches begin with the right and left primary bronchi near the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae. Each primary bronchus divides into secondary bronchuses to tertiary bronchi and even finer tubules. Generation numbers of progressively breaking pulmonary airways continue on. Generation 0 is the trachea. The first generation always are to the right and left primary bronchi, and so on. The bronchi passes cartilage up to about the 10th generation, where bronchioles, beginning about the 11th generation, they lack the cartilage. The conducting airways, whose function is to move air to those areas of the lungs that participate in gas exchange, begin at the nose and the lips and end at the terminal bronchioles of the lungs. Transitional airways, also called the transitional zone, is respiratory bronchioles generation 17 to 19. What these guys do, they participate in gas exchange over at least parts of their surfaces. They contain an increasing number of alveoli ducts, which now we call generation 20 through 22. Then you have the respiratory zone of the lungs, which is generations 20 through 23. Respiratory gas exchange, units of the lungs, the respiratory bronchioles, the alveoli ducts, and the alveoli are all responsible for that particular process. Within the alveoli themselves, each alveolar duct ends in an alveoli. Respiratory exchange between the lungs and the blood vessels occur in the alveoli at the alveoli capillary membrane. The alveoli are made up of two types of cells, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 alveolar cells are pneumocytes. Almost all are empty, allowing for better gas exchange. There's no liquid, there's no fluid, there's no nothing. It's just a bubble-like sac. Each alveolus has several type 2 pneumocytes, which can make up a new type 1 cell and produce surfactant. Surfactant is what reduces the surface tension that helps to keep the alveoli expanded. Alright, so when we talk about the lungs, we have three lobes, lower, middle, and upper in the right lung. Two lobes, lower and upper in the left lung. Remember that. There's always more on the right than there is on the left. And for you people that write right-handed, which each of you do, I can see that. You can remember that since you are right-handed, that is the three-lobe side. Surrounded by a membrane of connective tissue that we call pleura. The lungs also have visceral pleura, which is the pleural membrane that covers the lungs and the folds back to become the parietal pleura. Lungs receive blood. Okay. The pleural space, the potential space that can be created between the visceral space and parietal pleural because of the decrease in disease or trauma. Normally, the two membranes are closed together. No space exists there. Fluid, air, or blood may accumulate, potentially causing respiratory problems. There's two ways that the lungs receive blood. The oxygenated blood flows from the right ventricle via the pulmonary arteries and the capillaries. Peripherally in the lungs, venous blood from the bronchi enters the pulmonary veins, returning with oxygenated blood from the alveoli. So this is a pretty good little division. Shows you the different lungs, also shows you the pleural space, also gives you an idea of where the mediastinum is, and also the diaphragm, how it lays right up underneath the lungs themselves. We talk about volumes. Tidal volumes is the amount of air that's moved in a single breath. Inspiratory reserve volume is the additional amount of air that can be inhaled after a normal tidal volume has been reached. Expiratory reserve volume is the additional amount of air that can be exhaled after the normal tidal volume has been expelled. Residual volume It's the amount of air that remains in the lungs after maximum exhalation, which serves to prevent alveolar collapse or atelectasis by keeping the alveoli slightly inflated. Vital capacity is the amount of air moved within the maximum inspiration and expiration. Anatomic dead space is the portion of respiratory system that has no alveoli and therefore has little or no exchange of gas between the blood which occurs, such as the mouth, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles. They're all considered anatomic dead space. That's why when we're ventilating patients, we have to take an account for that dead space. When we start looking at rising end-tidal CO2 values, then we need to figure out, do we have more dead space than what we need? Because when we add more tubing onto our ventilators, that creates even more dead space where air can just sit and not move. Physiological dead space is a function of the amount of damaged alveoli that cannot participate in gas exchange. This varies widely based on medical history of the patient and exposure to toxins that damage the alveoli, among other factors. Minute volume. With minute volume, one of the critical determinants of effective ventilation, minute volume equals respiratory rate times tidal volume. Again, minute volume equals respiratory rate times tidal volume. This helps to determine how deeply a patient is breathing. Bottom line. In ventilation is the process of moving air in and out of the lungs. Gentlemen, it's either mechanical or natural, one way or the other. Ventilation is the act of movement. Respiration is the exchange of gases. Make sure you separate those two. That's extremely important. So the two separate phases of ventilation is inhalation, which we consider inspiration, and exhalation, which we say is expiration. In the respiratory cycle, each combination of inhalation and exhalation have to be perfectly timed. Importance of changes in pressures within the thoracic cavity that allow passive flow of air into and out of the lungs. This is how it works. The ability of the lungs to function properly and movement of the chest and supporting structures are very dependent on some things. The structures include the thorax, the thoracic cage, the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, the accessory muscles, also the chest wall muscles innervated by the intercostal nerves. The connection of the diaphragm to the sternum anteriorly, the ribs laterally, and also the vertebrae posteriorly. The diaphragm is also innervated by phrenic nerves. These are controlled by C3 and C5. They keep the diaphragm alive. So if you have a fracture in those areas, you risk knocking out the respiratory drive because there's no sensory or no motor action or no communication with the diaphragm itself. The diaphragm specifically functions as a voluntary muscle when you take a deep breath, cough, or hold your breath, and an involuntary muscle that performs the automatic function of when the concentration of carbon dioxide rises in the blood, the autonomic regulation of breathing resumes under the control of the brain stem. Inhalation. Boyle's law states that the pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume. Negative pressure ventilation is drawing of air into the lungs, airflow from a region of higher pressure, which is outside the body, to a region of lower pressure, the lungs, which occurs normal during breathing. Intrapulmonic pressure is the pressure within the lungs and the airways. One of the good examples of Boyle's law, when we talk about a pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume, is when we are relative to flight physiology. We are in a state of sea level, which we have a barometric pressure that is constant. As we raise our altitude, as altitude increases, barometric pressure decreases. So what happens is that when barometric pressure decreases, the only thing that keeps the molecules together in any given amount of space is barometric pressure. So a good example of that, you're traveling to Colorado, you're going to go see grandma, And when you're here in Orlando International Airport, you go into the kiosk and you buy yourself a bag of potato chips. That bag of potato chips is pretty soft and pliable, you know, and you say, I'm going to have this when I'm on my flight with a beer. Well, you get on the plane, get up to altitude, you're flying along, you take your bag of potato chips out, and it's like poofed up. Okay? That's because commercial aircraft don't maintain sea level pressures. They maintain a pressure anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level. Okay? They don't maintain sea level pressure. So what happens, barometric pressure decreases because now we're at an altitude of 5,000 feet. So it allows the molecules inside that bag to move further apart, therefore making your bag bigger, okay, until subsequently it would burst sooner or later. It's like if you let go of a balloon, helium, and it goes up, 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 it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until pow, it pops. That's how we get data from weather balloons. The weather balloon keeps expanding and keeps expanding and keeps expanding. It's like, ooh, this is great, this is great. It's going up high and high and higher and higher until it reaches the stratosphere, and then it pops, and then that thing falls to the ground and is destroyed. And if they're doing it in an area, they even have explosives on it where they can get rid of it, so it just comes down and sprinkles debris, so it doesn't come down on one solid object. That's how Boyle's law works. All right, so in exhalation, exhalation is a passive process. Okay, it does not require muscular effort. Intrapleural pressures is the pressure between the pleura and the lungs. Exhalation ends when the intrapleural pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure. The use of accessory muscles, not active during quiet breathing. If we're breathing normally, intercostal muscles are relaxed, everything's relaxed, kind of in and out, you know, no problem. But intercostal muscles, they allow the ribs to be pulled up and out, expanding thoracic cavity for more air. Can also help control opening up of the thorax itself. One of the things that I was told a long time ago that I like to reinforce with you guys on a constant basis is that respirations are supposed to be silent. Normal respirations are silent. So when you walk into the room and you hear somebody breathing, there's a problem. You're going to have to do something about it. Mechanism of ventilation. This is a good diagram. If you look up here on the left side, top left, diaphragm contracts. Okay? Diaphragm contracts. This is like a rubber band. The muscles have to be stretched down. They have to be pulled down. Your brain tells it, I want you to contract. Okay? It sucks air into your lungs. Your lungs wouldn't normally inflate. This is an active process. Down on the bottom, the signals stop. The diaphragm goes boing, just like you pulled the rubber band down. When you let go of it, it goes back into its normal shape, therefore pushing the air back out. So inhalation is an active process. Exhalation is a passive process. Everybody got that? All right, that's what this diagram shows. It's on slide 267. Oxygenation. Oxygenation requires that the air used for ventilation contain an adequate percentage of oxygen. Percentage of oxygen in any given contained area here on Earth is 21%. Whereas oxygenation cannot occur without ventilation, ventilation is possible without oxygenation. Ventilation without oxygenation may occur in places where oxygen level in the air has been depleted, such as underground mines, sewers, confined spaces, those kind of things. When other gases, an example would be carbon monoxide, prevent oxygen from binding to the hemoglobin, we got problems. So we've got ventilation, but there's no oxygenation because the carbon monoxide is blocking or bind to the red blood cells, therefore blocking the ability for those things the oxygen to transfer into the cells. It also occurs in climbers who ascend too quickly to an altitude with inadequate atmospheric pressure. Because as we described earlier with Boyle's law, as oxygen molecules, as barometric pressure decreases, the oxygen molecules move further apart. Well, they move further apart in a given amount of space, so they're less available for use. That's why when you're going up a mountain, kind of get short of breath, you got to stop a little bit, you got to get used to it because there's less oxygen available. The concentration is still the same. It's 21%. There's just less available than any square volume of air. Okay? Otherwise, what was known as climbers' problems are thin air when you're climbing a mountain. It's kind of what we're talking about. So, the fraction of inspired oxygen is FiO2. FiO2. It is the fraction of inspired oxygen which is directly related to the percentage of oxygen in inhaled air. So oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. This is a relationship between PaO2, SaO2, or SpO2, and is represented by the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Oxyhemoglobin is the hemoglobin that oxygen molecules bind to. It has to bind to this hemoglobin in order for it to be carried through to the cell. Oxygen saturation expressed as SpO2 if measured by pulse oximetry, and SaO2 as if it's measured in the arterial blood gases. So gentlemen, when you put the monitor on the finger, that is SpO2. That is not SaO2. If you're monitoring the oxygen concentration in an arterial line, it is represented by SaO2. That's the big difference. Okay? It's the proportion of oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma component of the blood. Okay, so the proportional, the blood, in the arterial blood gases is proportional to the amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma of the blood, which is relative to PaO2 representation. So, plasma component of blood concentration is PaO2. When the venous blood is returning to the heart during circulation, the blood is not completely devoid of oxygen. That is referred to as deoxygenation. When metabolism increases, the demand for oxygen increases as well, and venous blood contains less oxygen. In response to changes in metabolism, hemoglobin changes how tightly it holds onto the oxygen. Your body's always trying to maintain homeostasis. Because it's holding on to oxygen, this causes a shift in the position of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Other conditions that can also shift the curve to left and right do happen. Usually that's relative to trauma or some kind of response of a histamine release. Respiration. Alright, so now we're getting really truly out of the ventilation section of it. We're going to talk about respirations. Respiration is the exchange of gases between a living organism and the environment. It provides oxygen to the body while removing carbon dioxide. Either this is an internal respiration or external or internal respiration. One or the other. External respiration. This is the exchange of gases between the alveoli of the lungs and the RBCs through traveling of the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, so we breathe in oxygen, it comes in, we ventilate mechanically, or naturally. We bring that stuff in, and it has to go through an exchange process. Fresh air that is inspired into the lungs contains about 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, and about 0.3% carbon dioxide. As this air reaches into the alveoli, it comes into contact with surfactant. Surface tension within the alveoli is reduced and it keeps them expanded. Expansion facilitates the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. After the oxygen crosses the alveolar membrane, it is bound to the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin molecules that are low in oxygen concentration are pumped from the right side of the heart into the capillaries of the pulmonary circulation. The capillaries surround the alveoli containing high concentrations of oxygen from the inspired air. The hemoglobin molecules pick up fresh oxygen as it crosses the alveolar membrane and transport it back to the left side of the heart where it is pumped out to the rest of the body. As you can see in this diagram, you see the inhalation, you see a little square box taking you down to the pulmonary arteriole, the alveoli, the capillary, and the pulmonary venules. As you can see, there's an oxygen exchange where the oxygen is coming into the capillary beds and the CO2 is removing out of the venule beds. It's all relative to the rate of diffusion based on areas of higher concentration, lower concentration. In the venule side, you have higher concentration of CO2 than you have in the alveoli. So it goes into the alveoli from the venule and gets rid of that carbon dioxide. Oxygen passes through the semi-permeable membrane at the capillary level, and then since it is less rich than the oxygen that's inside the alveoli, the oxygen moves from the area of higher concentration into the area of lower concentration at the capillary bed, and then goes into the right side of the heart to be pumped out to the cells of the body. That is pulmonary respiration in simplicity, plain and simple. Alright, now we go to cellular respiration, otherwise known as internal respiration. Gases are exchanged between blood cells and tissues within the bloodstream. In the presence of oxygen, the mitochondria of the cells convert glucose into energy through aerobic metabolism. Aerobic metabolism, as we spoke earlier in the chapter, is a metabolism that requires oxygen to make it happen. Without adequate oxygen, the cells do not completely convert glucose into energy, and lactic acid and other toxins build up within the cell. This creates a process of anaerobic respiration. Processes cannot meet metabolic demands of the cells when they're in anaerobic states. Glycolysis does not require oxygen. It results in less ATP and more lactic acid waste products, and also toxins are produced along with that. The necessity of perfusion and ventilation has got to be the resolution of oxygenation. A series of events will eventually lead to cellular death without oxygen. So as we see here, we're seeing on the cellular side, you have the tissue cells you see in this diagram here on my right, to your right. Then you have your capillary oxygenation and carbon dioxide sides of the cells. And you can see that the exchange happens in a semi-permeable membrane from an area, once again, from area of higher concentration to lower concentrations. Either way, these cells have to pull carbon dioxide and waste out of those tissues in order to get rid of them. And just as well, the blood cells at the capillary level have to exchange oxygen back into the tissues as well. This process is aerobic metabolism. Okay. This is the internal respiration, or cellular respiration, that occurs every millisecond in your body. Alright, so the role of diffusion. Oxygen transfers from air into capillaries in the alveoli involves diffusion. Several concepts are very useful in understanding the process. It is partial pressure that facilitates this. Partial pressure is the amount of gas in air or dissolved in liquid, such as the blood. This is governed by what we call Henry's law, which states that as the pressure of a gas over a liquid decreases, the amount of gas dissolved into the liquid will also decrease. Here's a perfect example. Henry's beer. Okay? Imagine a can of beer. The only thing that Henry can do is he provides the pressure on top. That is the pull tab. Henry is the pull tab. When you pop that pull tab, the gas that's trapped and being held within the container itself will dissolve and leave the can and into the air. Okay? But as long as the pressure of the gas over the liquid decreases, the amount of gas in the dissolved in the liquid will also decrease. So Henry's law is telling us that if that can, okay, if the pressure decreases in that thing and it allows it to open up, the gases dissolved in that liquid, the CO2 in the beer, will escape. It will decrease. The amount of gas that's in that liquid will decrease. This comes very relevant, and sooner or later we'll talk about it, especially in the bends, because when we have nitrogen in our body and we decide that we're going to go flying, And so therefore we're decreasing the barometric pressure that holds that gas in. It will diffuse into the tissues and cause the bends. Maybe even chokes and paresthesia. That's diving emergencies. Those are called relative barotrauma type of injuries due to diving loss. Alright, so in this diagram we talk about how that exchange is going to happen in the role of diffusion. Inspired air is a mixture of 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen and 0.04% roughly of carbon dioxide, and a nominal amount of other gases exerting a pressure of 760 millimeter HD or 760 torr at sea level. The sum of the partial pressures is equal to the total pressure of the mixture. Because the gases are lipid soluble, they can freely cross the cell membrane and move by diffusion. Partial pressures of the air mixture are responsible for diffusion across the cell membranes. Of the gases dissolved in various blood returning to the lungs, carbon dioxide exerts a high partial pressure and oxygen exerts a low partial pressure. This is reversed within the inside of the lungs itself. As a result of that, carbon dioxide diffuses out of the venous blood and into the lungs. Oxygen diffuses out of the alveoli and into the arterial blood, where 97% of the oxygen combined with the hemoglobin molecule for the RBC to transport it to the cells. When arterial blood reaches the capillary, oxygen diffuses out of the arterial blood and into the interstitial fluid, and eventually into extracellular fluid, or intracellular fluid, where they combine with carbon dioxide diffuses out of the interstitial fluid and back into the venous blood to be returned and then expelled out of the lungs. That carbon dioxide is transported by one of three methods by the venous blood, while oxygen is transported by the hemoglobin. Because of this, two molecules may be carried at the same time without competing for binding sites on the hemoglobin. Control of breathing. What regulates it? Regulation of the changes primarily by the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid, the CSF. Directly related to the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma portion of the blood, the PaCO2, the responsiveness of the CSF is to stimulate our breathing. Stimulate the regulation and ventilation via a series of receptors of feedback loops that do the following. They sense gas concentrations in bodily fluids, and they send messages to the respiratory centers of the brain to adjust the rate and depth of ventilation accordingly. This is one of the biggest things that's a part of our acid-base balance, is being able to blow off carbon dioxide so we don't build up too much lactic acid. Neural control of ventilation is the control of the system that regulates involuntary breathing, and it's made up of three components. First being the control center, which consists of three pairs of respiratory centers in the reticular formation of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and then there's one on each and the right sides of each left and right sides of the brainstem. You have specifically the ventral respiratory group, or VRG, which is a specific area of the medulla oblongata that can cause inspiration or expiration depending on which motor neurons are stimulated. Then you have the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG. It is the portion of the medulla oblongata that functions as a respiratory integration center, which receives inputs from several different sources. Then you have the pontine respiratory group, or PRG. It is a portion of the pons, therefore that's why it's called pontine. It is the portion of the pons that communicates information to both the ventral and the dorsal respiratory groups, and it's also thought to be it helps to smooth the transition between each phases of the ventilatory cycle and alter the breathing depending on the body's needs. Alright, so also you have effectors, which are the respiratory muscles, sensors, that include central chemoreceptors in the medulla, peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and the aortic bodies, mechanoreceptors, which are located in the chest wall, in the lung stretch receptors, and the skin's thermoreceptors. You also have proprioreceptors in the muscles, tendons, and the joints, and also irritant receptors within the trachea and the large airways. This figure shows the important structures in the regulation of ventilations to include the chemoreceptors, which are located in A, and also the respiratory centers, which are located in the B figure. This is slide 278 of 343 slides. Alright, so also in the chemical control, or the effects of breathing, control of breathing, we have the chemical side of it. The goal of the respiratory system is to keep blood concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide and its acid-base balances within very narrow margins. Chemoreceptors monitor variables and provide feedback back to our respiratory system. The central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla. They respond to very significant or slight changes in carbon dioxide and also the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid. Peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies respond to changes in PO2 and also PCO2 and pH. Chemoreceptors respond to medical conditions and traumatic injury by stimulating the respiratory control centers to increase the ventilatory rate, thus removing more carbon dioxide or acid from the body. Patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, otherwise known as COPD, such as emphysema and chronic bronchitis, have difficulty eliminating their carbon dioxide. In patients with end-stage COPD, the body uses a backup system to control the breathing called the hypoxic drive, which stimulates breathing when the arterial oxygen levels fail. Lung receptors, these are specific receptors located within the lungs themselves, one being the mechanical receptors. They're located within the bronchioles and the visceral. They're smooth muscles location. When the lungs inflate, they stretch. These stretch type of receptors are stimulated and nerve signals are sent along the respiratory centers by the vagus nerves to inhibit inspiration. This is called the Herring-Brewer reflex. It's designed to prevent overinflation of our lungs. Irritant receptors, they're located among the epithelial cells of the airway mucous membranes. They're stimulated by smoke, pollen, dust, excess mucus, chemical fumes, and cold air. They trigger protective reflexes such as coughing, bronchoconstriction, and shallow breathing. There are buffer systems. There's tons of buffer systems within the body. Buffer systems act as a rapid defense for acid-base balances. Three buffer systems are primary, considering the circulatory bicarbonate buffer component of the respiratory system and also the renal system. Basically, we can produce bicarbonate through sodium and the mixture of sodium and carbon dioxide, and also we can produce certain levels of acid as well, lactic acid, to re-acidize the system if it gets too alkalotic. And then, of course, our renal system can always excrete water at any given time. Circulating bicarbonate buffer components, such as excess acid hydrogen, combines with bicarbonate, HCO3, to form carbonic acid, and then rapidly dissociates into water, which is then exhaled. Eventually, the carbon dioxide is gotten rid of, and the exhalation, which will bring everything back to the normality. Your respiratory buffer component, aside from the circulatory bicarbonate buffer, is the fastest way the body can eliminate hydrogen ions through ventilation processes. The renal buffer component, like I mentioned earlier, is the kidneys. They monitor hydrogen and bicarbonate levels in the tubules and the nephrons to maintain pH. This takes about hours or days, so it takes time for you to recover from true metabolic acidosis. The control of ventilation by other factors. There's multiple other factors that influence control of ventilatory rates, such as elevated body temperature, central nervous system, stimulants, pain, emotion, hypoxia, and acidosis cause an increase in ventilatory rate. Also, sleep, it decreases metabolic states, and CNS depressants as well cause it, and also including alcohol, they also all decrease ventilatory rates, which can affect your buffer systems. Alright, with that, we're going to go ahead and stop here. This is slide 282, which begins the last lecture. We'll stop and let you clock out a virtual time clock, and then go ahead and clock into test 5 of 6 for chapter 8. And with that, we'll see you next time.